How do sociologists define race and racism? How do they distinguish between race and ethnicity? How do they make sense of discrimination based on one's race or ethnicity? What does it mean to say that systemic racism exists and is enacted every day? What is settler colonialism? And what does it mean to decolonize social problems? On this episode, we are talking about race, ethnicity, discrimination, and systemic racism. So sit back, grab a snack, and let's get to it. My name is Dr. Derek Silva, and I'm an associate professor of criminology studying harm and injustice in the social world. On this episode of Social Problems, we are talking about race, ethnicity, and what it means to decolonize social problems. In this episode, we'll talk about some of the concepts related to race, ethnicity, and racialization, and talk about some of the ways in which sociologists work to understand each, and more importantly, the inequality that manifests in relation to them throughout the social structure. There is a strong consensus amongst sociologists that society is conditioned and structured by race, and it is therefore absolutely vital for us to explore the ways in which race impacts one's life course, including socioeconomic opportunity and mobility, experiences with overt and individual forms of racism, and interactions with the social institutions that continue to build in discriminatory policies, all broadly understood as contributing to systemic forms of racism, prejudice, and racial discrimination. Prejudice is defined here as a hostile or aversive attitude towards a person because of that person's membership in a particular group. By contrast, discrimination is defined by the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights as, quote, any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin that is the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment of, or exercise of human rights and fundamental freedoms. The term race has traditionally been used as a term to identify the division of the world's population into groups based on visual traits, most notably the color of one's skin. It is a social category that works to distinguish amongst the population by identifying those who share distinctive and inherited physical characteristics. Many people think of race in biological terms, but sociologists hold that there is a need to move away from considering race as a biological construct and to examine the ways in which the concept of race is different from ethnicity. Sociologists describe race as a social construction, as something that is not an innate, natural, and immutable objective fact, but rather as a concept that describes the social meanings ascribed to racial categories. Race is a category that groups people who share similar biological characteristics that a particular society, at a particular point in time, deems to be socially significant. It is absolutely not that biological differences don't exist that makes something like race a social construction. Absolutely, there are biological differences between groups of people. Rather, sociologists argue that people's understanding of these differences are shaped by the society they live, and thus shape the ways in which those differences are understood across society. And since people's understanding of these differences are shaped by society, and those in turn shape the society in which we all live, racial categorization is inevitably connected to all parts of the social structure, including social stratification and the inequality that manifests as a consequence. Race is distinct from ethnicity. Indeed, while race is used as a descriptor for categories of physical appearance which are more or less connected to genetic biology, that biology plays an incredibly small role in the formation, development, and maintenance of ethnic categories. In this way, ethnicity can perhaps be best defined as the shared social, cultural, and historic experiences that often come from common national or regional backgrounds, and that help forge and distinguish subgroups from a broader population. Culture is defined as the way of life of a society that includes dress, language, norms of behavior, foods, tools, beliefs, and folklore. This framework of values and practices adapts to the changing socio-historical context. An ethnic group is the subgroup of the population who hold a set of shared social, cultural, and historical experiences, and thus often hold relatively distinct beliefs, values, and behaviors. These groups often hold a strong sense of belonging to the subgroup. Ethnicity is used to describe cultural groups that are bonded through social interaction and share ideas of culture, including language, customs, and institutions. In the context of a world categorized by large-scale globalization, which we'll talk about in a separate video, ethnic groups often form what are called diasporas, or the scattering of ethnic groups across the world whose social, cultural, and historical origin lies in a separate geographical location. Think of all the geographically segregated ethnic communities in global cities like Toronto or even in London. Ethnic communities often forge bonding and create local communities based on shared culture, language, and customs, and those often lead to the creation of community institutions like churches, banks, credit unions, and other political structures. The diaspora can then be analyzed for its so-called institutional completeness, which is a measure used by sociologists to understand the degree to which an immigrant ethnic group gives its own members the services they need through its own local institutions. This completeness is often a mode of adaptation for ethnic groups to deal with the forms of racial and ethnic inequality that they deal with in their day-to-day lives. In your read, watch, and respond, please answer the following questions. How does race differ from ethnicity? Why do you think people may prefer to use one term over the other? The sociology of race and ethnicity is interested in the study of social, political, and economic relations between racial identities and ethnicities at all levels of society. It includes a study of broad systemic racism, like residential segregation based on racial and ethnic identity across Canada, and other complex social processes between different racial and ethnic groups. Scholars in this field view race and ethnicity as primary drivers of a host of social problems: economic inequality and lack of opportunities, racism and discrimination, health disparities, legal disparities, and criminalization. For example, in Canadian sociology, one of the key areas of this field has been the critique of settler colonialism and the ongoing effects of colonial expansion, cultural assimilation, and exploitative Western relationships, including academic ones. Settler colonialism can perhaps be best defined as a form of colonialism that explicitly seeks to replace the original population of a colonized territory rather than just extract resources and raw materials like oil. Settler colonialism is about setting up as settlers and living there, setting up a new society through the exogenous domination of indigenous groups. Certainly this is extractionary in nature, as the settler conquers land and the people inhabiting it, and thus will benefit from resources. But the primary goal is not necessarily just resource extraction. It is to set up a new society. Sociologists in Canada have documented how Canadian history is characterized as a history of settler colonialism. And this has resulted in the structuring of a racial hierarchy in Canadian law and practice that disproportionately negatively impacts Indigenous peoples and groups. For example, from at least 1880 to the closing of the last school in Saskatchewan in 1996, the residential school system was created through partnerships between the Canadian government and Christian churches that removed Indigenous children from their homes and the influence of their own culture and brought them to residential schools with the purpose of assimilating them into the so-called dominant Canadian tradition. Over the course of the system's life course, 150 or about 30% of Indigenous children were placed in residential schools, where it is well documented that they experienced overt racism and discrimination, corporeal punishment, sexual and physical abuse, deprivation of ancestral languages, and other forms of violence. The legacy of the system has been linked with intergenerational trauma and increased prevalence of post-traumatic stress, anxiety, alcoholism and substance abuse, and suicide that persist within Indigenous communities today. Importantly, this history is documented by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which from 2008 to 2015 analyzed the long history of settler colonialism in Canada and the residential school system, its lasting effects, and the political and legal system's complicity in endorsing systemic racism and structural inequality. In 2015, the TRC released an executive summary of its findings, along with 94 calls to action regarding paths towards reconciliation between Canada and Indigenous peoples and groups. This was a groundbreaking achievement and is of massive social and historical importance in terms of attempts to decolonize the social structure. Decolonization, then, is the process of undoing colonialism. It is a process that directly counters colonialism as the process whereby a nation establishes and maintains control and domination over foreign territories through ongoing theoretical and political processes used to contest and reframe narratives about Indigenous community histories and the effects of colonial expansion. This history often conflicts with the trope that Canada can be characterized by its core feature of multiculturalism. That is, that Canada is an incredibly diverse and inclusive society that is open to all regardless of racial or ethnic group, and a society that celebrates differences in political, legal, and social institutions. Traditional multiculturalism, also known as pluralism, is concerned with protecting the rights of racialized people through provincial and human rights codes. By contrast, modern multiculturalism is concerned with the survival of diverse cultural groups, and it is the ethnic or racial group that is protected by law. Indeed, multiculturalism policy has had a long and complicated history in Canada and elsewhere. One of the most well-renowned Canadian sociologists, John Porter, developed the concept of the vertical mosaic to illustrate the stratification of race and ethnicity in Canada, particularly with respect to diverse immigrant populations. The vertical mosaic, for Porter, is a socio-economic hierarchy in which French and English Canadians live at the top and other ethnic groups are positioned below. Immigrants and other racialized folks are given lower entrance status, which is the status granted to an individual upon official entry into Canada, and thus faces a number of tangible barriers to upward mobility in Canada. Porter noted that while Canada prides itself on its acceptance of multiculturalism, it is structured in such a way that makes it incredibly difficult for racial and ethnic groups, particularly new immigrant groups, to achieve the same social status as other groups. In other words, to achieve upward mobility. In your read, watch, and respond, please answer the following questions. How does the vertical mosaic work? And what are some of the key challenges faced by new immigrants in Canada? The reason sociologists say that race is a social construction is because what it means to be Black, Brown, Asian, Indigenous, white, and so on is defined according to a culture, a history, and a specific context given at a particular time and place. The meanings of these generalized terms have changed, and often change very rapidly. What has not changed, however, is that racial groups are placed into a social hierarchy which structures the day-to-day lives of people quite differently. One of the consequences of this social structuring is what we call racialization, or the tendency in a community to introduce racial distinctions into situations that can be understood and managed without them. In other words, the way social institutions impose racial identities on people. The imposition of such racial identities thus serves a function of giving and embedding social meaning into race and racial identities. This is a political and social process that ascribes ethnic or racial identities to an interaction, relationship, social practice, or a group that did not identify itself as such. For example, in a wonderful sociological expose of the U.S. agricultural system, Marta Maria Maldonado has documented how agricultural managers and executives successfully connected Latinx identities to a specific type of racialized labor that is erroneously thought to be well suited for them. Companies have successfully connected Latinx labor with menial tasks rather than more skilled ones in order to pay them less, keep them precarious, and offer little to no health and economic benefits. There is nothing inherent to Latinx labor that makes them more efficient at such menial work. It is the process of racialization that imposes and reinforces presupposed and stereotypical qualities on them by the racializer. Then, as renowned Duke sociologist Bonilla Silva has suggested, racialization like this can then be normalized through the promotion of what he calls colorblindness, or the idea that racial classification like this does not affect a person's opportunities in life course. In other words, to make connections like the one Maldonado documents feel quote-unquote normal and natural is to promote a colorblind approach to racism that has the opposite effect. It is itself a process of racialization that is intended to condition the economic reward and opportunities available and limit upward mobility of a person based on race. Sociologists have also distinguished different ways in which racial prejudice and discrimination may manifest in the forms of individual, institutional, and internalized racism. And these all have different impacts on society. Individual racism is the so-called classic form of prejudice, in which a person makes unfounded assumptions about the motives and abilities of another based on a stereotypical understanding of the person's racial or ethnic group characteristics. It is the unapologetic, overt, and unfactual assumptions about a person based on their racial or ethnic group. Institutional, or often called structural racism, on the other hand, is any form of racism that occurs specifically from within an institution, such as public government bodies and private business corporations. This form of racism is quote-unquote built into these prominent structures. For example, Jim Crow laws were state and local laws enacted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to enforce racial segregation in the southern U.S. throughout. These laws were explicitly meant to enforce racial segregation and enact inequality and the systemic oppression of black folks. And as Michelle Alexander has documented in her best-selling The New Jim Crow, while Jim Crow laws were abolished decades ago, there are new forms of structural racism that have emerged in their place. Most notable of these is the criminal justice system's complicity in the rise of mass incarceration that disproportionately criminalizes black, brown, indigenous, and other people of color. For Alexander, the war on drugs, the structure of the U.S. criminal justice system, and a host of new legislative frameworks amounts to a contemporary system of racial control through its adherence to the principle of color blindness. In other words, how the justice system supposedly does not see color. In your read, watch, and respond, please answer the following questions. What is one example of racialization in the police and judicial systems? How do you think racialization might impact race and ethnic relations more broadly? There is also internalized racism. First, there is also internalized racism, first defined by Karen Pike as, quote, There is also internalized racism, first defined by Karen Pike as the internalization of racial oppression by the racially subordinated. It is when group members of an ethnic or racial group accept and sometimes behave according to imposed stereotypes by a hegemon power. The sociology of health, for example, which we'll focus on in another episode, has documented extremely high and consistent scores across internalized racism scales that have repeatedly correlated with a number of poor physiological and psychological health outcomes. For example, scholars have documented how forms of internalized racism, such as the rationalizing of negative thoughts about oneself, is associated with a host of anxiety disorders that have been found to be more persistent in Black American populations as compared to other racial groups. Finally, the chapter talks about aversive racism. This can be characterized as a process where some sympathize with the victims of past injustice and support policies that promote racial equality, but who nonetheless hold prejudicial views towards other races themselves. And this often manifests in a persistent avoidance of interaction with other racial or ethnic groups. As opposed to overt racism characterized by overt hatred for and discrimination against racialized groups, aversive racism is characterized by more ambivalent prejudicial expressions and attitudes towards other races. For example, these folks may emphatically reject notions that they are racist while supporting equality and equity, but turn around and change their behavior when dealing with a racialized person, or in a context with racialized folks. And they may even hold prejudicial views about them altogether. In this way, aversive racism can be much more insidious than other forms of racism. Put differently, aversive racism can be seen as a cause of social distance, or feelings of aloofness and unapproachability often felt between members of different social strata, or from different racial or ethnic groups. In your read, watch, and respond, please compare individual racism and aversive racism. Which form of racism do you think is more detrimental for victims? Whereas structural functionalists have historically failed to develop specific analyses of race, instead arguing that social categories including race and ethnicity serve important functions as constituent parts of a broader society, and thus consequential inequality serves a quote-unquote function in society. Conflict theorists and symbolic interactionists hold that race is a fundamental structuring force in society. W.E.B. Du Bois, for example, theorized about the intersections of race, class, and nation, and how they explain the core features of Black political economy, centered on a racialized system of labor exploitation of Black bodies. Du Bois, as perhaps the most influential sociologist of all, argued that race and race-related issues were necessary units of analysis for philosophical study, precisely because of their social structuring tendencies. Rather than diverting attention away from race as a core structuring tenet of society, Du Bois maintained that we must empirically analyze the ways in which race manifests in contemporary life head on in order to deal with the realities of what it means to live as a racialized person. More contemporary scholars like Cedric O. Robinson have called this political economy racial capitalism, or the structural processes that systematically extract wealth from Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other communities of color that are embedded in advanced capitalism. In other words, that capitalism itself is structured with racial discrimination and exploitation as core features, not unintended consequences. And folks working within the intersectionality and critical race theory paradigms like Kimberly Crenshaw, Bell Hooks, and Patricia Hill Collins work within this perspective to highlight the ways in which gender, race, class, sexuality, ability status, and other social categorizations do not operate in isolation of one another, but they are interrelated and come together to construct and reinforce a system that consists of different forms of oppression. Similarly, symbolic interactionists focus on the ways in which people, groups, and institutions attach meaning to the social world, and thus to race and ethnicity themselves. Scholars working within this tradition hold that race and ethnicity are indeed social constructs, but deeper than that, they are constructions that shape the ways in which we see, understand, and interact with those around us at all times. According to symbolic interactionists, we are constantly generating meaning through interactions with the life world, and those meanings shape how we act in all contexts. They shape how we see others, how we talk to them, how we talk about them, how we see institutions like governments, politics, schools, etc. Those interactions then can produce and reproduce and reflect forms of power and privilege, discrimination and oppression, bias and prejudice, and so on, which can then work in patterns to create broad social and structural contexts that shape the lives of racialized individuals and groups. For example, a symbolic interactionist would say that there is a great deal of meaning sent and received in a simple interaction, like meeting someone for the first time and asking, "Hey, where are you from?" This seems like an innocuous question at first glance, but symbolic interactionists hold that it is deeply embedded with meaning that shapes the very interaction. What happens if I say, "here," and move on? What about if I say that I'm from another city, another country, or another continent? What if I speak another language? How might that shape the very interaction itself and our experiences as actors in that interaction? I'm sure many of you can recall a time where you've been asked that question or have asked someone else that question. For some, it's simply used to signal familiarity or proximity and often enhances social bonding throughout the interaction. At times, however, the response may signal that someone does not belong to that particular social group and may cause an abrupt shift in the interaction. For symbolic interactionists, race and ethnicity are social constructions that operate in every sphere of life and condition the ways in which we extract and give meaning to, understand, and communicate the meaning that we generate from social life. So it's really a useful paradigm to understand race, ethnicity, racialization, and racism. So that's it for today. I hope you learned something about race, ethnicity, racialization, and the importance of decolonizing how we understand society and social problems. This has been Professor Silva, and I'll catch you on the next episode of Social Problems.